the only instrument capable of furthering the Paris Agreement goals without further reliance from public or private partners, meaning other countries or private partners, is actually the reform of the fiscal system, where countries can tap into their own resources and their own taxpayers in order to raise revenues that can be used in the energy transition process. So then the intention is to actually mold the fiscal system so that it is aligned with the country's nationally determined contributions, and so that it meets emissions mitigation targets under those nationally determined contributions. So emissions mitigation is actually reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, and it's a very important target under the NDCs, and it can be achieved through the use of particularly tax instruments that put a price. It is also important for the purposes of obtaining equity in the application of border carbon adjustment measures. Now, we all know that currently we only have in force the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the EU CBAM. And what the EU CBAM says is that it only allows for compensating measures from countries that have a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme.
That this entire discussion began with a very, very interesting question as to who should be a first mover and who should be a laggard, and what is the benefit of being a first, or pros and cons of being a first mover and a laggard. Now, if global solidarity is something that Pascal mentioned, if there is actually global solidarity in this discussion, and these discussions are being done in good faith, then the first mover should be that part of the world which is responsible for where we are today. And I don't mean to say that the rest of the world should be a laggard, but that's where things like common but differentiated responsibilities come from. So while do nothing is an option, is not an option, but at the same time, to place the same level of burden on all parts of the world may not be a feasible solution. Now, without getting into this discussion as to who is more responsible, who is less responsible, the way the finances of the countries are as they are, it is not possible for every country to invest equally into these new technologies or levy the same level of taxes on their business enterprises who may not be using what we call green technologies. Let's take a country of India, now our business environment is scattered with MSMEs, and many of them have often been accused of using technologies that are not exactly green technologies. Now imagine if you were to levy a tax on these entities, you would end up folding up their business. Or if you were to say that if we would give you cheaper finance only if you adopt a green technology, the access to that green technology itself could be a very costly matter for that entity. It would be another cost for him to find personnel who could apply that technology or use that technology. So the so-called carrot of a cheaper finance would actually be an unattainable goal for such an entity. And then you would levy a higher interest rate for if he's using a technology which does not fall into what we call a green technology. So therefore, we cannot begin at the same pace everywhere. Now, India, for example, it's not that we've not done anything. We have a carbon cess, or we've tried to extend some kind of incentives for EV vehicles, what Meyyappan was mentioning. Now, yes, we have to keep moving up the scale. We cannot stay at where we are today. But at the same time, we have to calibrate our response and allow countries that much time and that much leverage, countries like India and even smaller countries.
If we go back, you must have followed the COP29 outcome. And I think what strikes me is that there's such a great difference in attitude towards climate change in countries. You know, you've got some countries that want to, like Sweden, want to lead by example. You know, we're going to be right in front and we're going to really have a very aggressive approach to try to price and curb emissions. And we've got some countries that we expect to withdraw from the Paris Accord and dismantle existing environmental policies, with the new administration coming into the United States in January. And that makes me beg the question, which is really a policy question that every government will have to face, and actually every individual will have to face as to what actions they take. Why would you embrace a first mover approach? Because remember, there's tremendous costs that come with being a first mover and taking actions.
The money is on carbon because we emit massively. For the first time last year, or actually this year in 24, oh no, it was last year, sorry, in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, for the COP28 it was, you had for the first time in the COP mechanism decarbonization, which was mentioned. It's fascinating. You're talking about climate change, you're talking about the COP, decarbonization was not mentioned. So when you look at all that, plus in the last G20 finance ministers communique of Brazil, the one which was issued in July, you have a reference to carbon pricing. So when you look at all that, it's going to happen. But it's not happening. Why is it not happening? Because carbon pricing is regressive. It's regressive within a country, and it's regressive between countries. Because within countries, if you impose carbon taxation, you impose a tax on the south, which is suffering from climate change and is not responsible for climate change. So when you engage in a conversation, which I did when I was at the OECD with the finance minister of India, she tells you, rightfully so, you polluted for 200 years, and now you would like me to pay for that? No way, I'm ready to decarbonize, show me the money. And we're back to the money. So in that environment, what do? Because if you move first, you first put your people in the street, you have riots, and you lose, if you don't have riots, like in Sweden, you lose competitiveness because you increase the relative prices and therefore you put your own industry at risk. So what's happening there? Well, first, and that's what we see with different proposals, the one Tatiana exposed, the IMF, which is proposing a carbon floor, but also the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation approaches at the OECD. At least you try to share what I've shared with you, to make the politicians realize that we're not yet there. And you have people like Meyyappan, the Prime Minister of Barbados, saying, look, we need to invest massively. We need to protect the countries which will disappear. We need to give access to cheaper capital to do the energy transition. We also need solidarity levies, global solidarity levies. And there is a task force, I'm an advisor to, on global solidarity levies to try to find ways. Still, you have some countries moving. You talked about Sweden, I would talk about the European Union. But if you move, you need to protect yourself.
The history to COP29, if you go back, is that for the last 10 years, the commitment was to give at least $100 billion, which was now increased to 300. But the ask was actually a lot higher, was at least a minimum of 500 billion a year. And the real requirement when we do the math from an Indian perspective is at least 1.3 trillion over the next 10 years or so. And we need incremental investments to that tune to do the decarbonization, to do the energy transformation. And when we look at the timing of this payment, it's not that it's required 100 billion a year. You need bulk of it upfront as soon as possible, because a lot of this is going to go into capex, into converting traditional energy systems into renewable energy systems and making it clean energy. The second problem we are facing is also on the financing side is that the return expectations are very high. The reality is that we might think that, investments in solar, you'll see a lot of investments in the news, that these are viable investments today. So where is the lack of funding, right? So let's say we're getting 100 billion today. That's because the cost of the cost of capital, the return expectation on equity in an investment to decarbonize a steel plant in India is 19%. Whereas if you were to do the same project in Europe, it's about 5%. Now, This is a combination of different reasons. There is payment risk, there is regulatory risk, tax risk, there is currency risk. So all of this adds up. The more risk there is, the more the return expectations are. So keeping this in mind, right? Even when we break down the numbers, so our requirement is 1.3 trillion, right? If you see the total impact investment, I was seeing the Impact Investors Council report yesterday. The last 10 years, we have received 40 billion in impact investment. 40 billion in 10 years. So the money that's coming in through investment is very, very low. The second takeaway is, I think it's widely accepted that public resources are not going to be sufficient to finance this. We're going to have to rely heavily on private finance to bring the money in to make this transition possible. Now, to make the private money coming in, right? So if you're having return expectations of 19%, obviously that it seems very risky and you're not getting $500 billion at that rate. So to de-risk it, you need to have better regulatory regimes, and that's a very, very sort of different path we need to go down by. So at this 19% return expectation, one of my concerns is that, if we add an environmental tax to that, it only adds to the cost of financing. So a plant that needs to decarbonize today, which is already struggling to raise finance at 19% return expectations, will get pushed up to 22%, 23% if you start adding taxes to that. So I think to take a step back and look at this from a policy perspective, I think we need to be very careful as to, I think the key takeaway is, yes, we need to price carbon. I don't think there is any sort of two ways about that. I think the context-specific discussion, which maybe we need to think about a little more, is it to be a tax or is it to be a pricing mechanism through another method and not necessarily a tax? Because
wait and watch approach may be unwise for India. Pascal mentioned that having your own CBAM or something like that would help achieve mitigation goals and raise domestic revenue. But also it would allow India to take a proactive step in engaging with this effort of shaping what the standards are like and what regulations are like. India has been doing that with other international tax matters, so possibly it's a good idea for them to even take the same approach to environmental taxes. And anyways, as more countries will adopt CBAM, because UK is already thinking of, or they've already gotten it, so it's not just the EU anymore. It'll become more attractive anyway if you're the laggard. You may not be able to remain that way for too long. So even if it's a reactive retaliatory measure, I think the idea of CBAM itself is to trigger a cycle where more nations adopt some sort of carbon pricing, whether it's a tax or whatever, but to participate and come to the table, like possibly what DSTs did with Pillar 2 or Pillar 1, that it got people to the negotiating table. So I think that is possibly one way India can look at it. So also coming to businesses, so in July 2024, there was a meeting of the European Commission with Indian officials in New Delhi. And one of the key issues which was discussed was the impact on Indian businesses, particularly MSMEs. And India has a lot of them, a lot of small businesses, a lot of fragmented businesses, and how they would be impacted by this. And key sectors in India is cement, iron and steel, and fertilizers, which are around 8 billion of exports to the EU every year, which would face challenges, especially because India's energy is heavily reliant on coal, which is a more pollutive sort of energy. So India is going to face challenges from CBAM and CBAM-like levies. So we have to be prepared for that and how to help smaller businesses, transition. So larger companies may have the resources, both monetary or technological know-how to invest in decarbonization, but smaller companies may not be able to afford to do so. They may not have the resources, the time, the ability to pivot or change to kind of meet these standards of, because CBAM also comes with it, reporting and monitoring and verification and things like that.